My name is Elvis Avignon, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Johannesburg. So between 2011 and 2013, both the economists and the time portrayed a very high optimism about Africa's prospects. And we see, examining the cover pages of these papers, we see that in 2011, Economist was like Africa Rising, with a young boy holding a rainbow map of Africa. And in 2012, we see a tree with some buildings. But in 2013, we see a giraffe. And the most important thing here, I think, is that we see the sun is setting. What I interpret that to mean is that between 2011 and 2012, the high optimism about our growth prospect has lost steam, and the prospect for sustained growth has rather dimmed. And this has been due to two main reasons: low global prices of natural resources and the inability of the past growth process to significantly impact living standards of the continent. It could be through, for example, decent employment. So today we do see some resurgence in growth, and it's been mentioned today that out of the 10 most developing countries, 5 are from Africa, ranging from Ethiopia to Rwanda to Sierra Leone to Ghana, where I come from. But I'm not very much happy about the growth rate because, as indicated earlier, we need double growth rates in Africa because the issues that we are dealing with are quite numerous, ranging from premature deindustrialization, low productivity, unemployment, among many others. And one issue that's often cited is the low innovativeness of the private sector. Private sector innovation is being identified to be very crucial in driving economic progress. And in our lifetime, we've seen the Asian tigers use private sector innovations to remarkably catch up. So we can say fundamentally that private sector innovation is fundamental to Africa's growth prospects. And we've seen from policy briefs from the African Union in the STISA and STISA 2024 and the 2023 agreements that innovation is very central. But we still have a lot of questions that remain very unanswered. One is, what factors drive private sector innovations? And one other is, how do the various symbiotic interactions that have been identified in the literature between formal and informal enterprises affect innovation activities? I would like to focus briefly, in the remaining time I have, to focus a bit more on the latter question. So, from the countries we all come from, I believe we have the informal sector, which is very significant in our countries. So the informal sector does not only provide or serve as a source of livelihood to millions, but it also serves one key purpose. It serves as a source of product market competition for formal businesses. And most often, we tend to neglect this very key role the informal enterprises play. So, while competition is generally seen as a driver of efficiency and vertical product differentiation, informal competition, which is given by informal enterprises, is largely considered as negative. And if you read the literature, it indicates that it's one of the top 3 obstacles formal businesses face in the product market. So in my research, I examined some of these issues in 5 sub-Saharan African countries: DRC, Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia, in the bid to provide some further understanding of how competition that comes from the informal enterprises enhance innovativeness of formal businesses. So briefly, our results do show, or the evidence shows, that yes, informal enterprises compete locally in the sense that they only compete in their local vicinities because probably of their size, but also they do inhibit the innovativeness of formal enterprises. But I think the most interesting result is that we see registered businesses that tend to do better innovatively are the ones that have strategic footholds in the informal economy. What that means is businesses that tend to do better are the ones that collaborate and outsource some of their activities through the markets, through the informal enterprises. So in terms of policy, we do see these days that almost all African countries are enacting their innovation policies. And we heard today that Rwanda is also in the process of coming out with its own innovation policy. What most of the time underlies these innovation policies is the national innovation system, which indicates to us the various actors in the national system where we have some interactions operating in a very institutional setting. The problem with national system of innovations in Africa, the way it is implemented, is that it fails to sort of solve our problems. Because one, we just simply adopt these systems from the developed countries, which doesn't necessarily take into consideration our local context of innovation. So one of the recommendations I suggest is that we need to adapt these systems of innovations, if it works, into our local context. Because one, our institutions mostly are informal. Our interactions mostly are informal. So we need to have informal interactions, informal institutions into our national innovation systems. And also, we need policy to incubate and nurture the vibrant entrepreneurial activities that is happening in the informal economy, which could be the learning processes, the entrepreneurship processes, the apprenticeship processes. And these may be the only way we can understand the kind of innovations that our enterprises tend to be engaged in. And maybe, just maybe, this is what matters for Africa to aspire and for us to rise. Thank you.
So, Shito, let me ask you, you're also an expert in entrepreneurship and business innovation. What additional comments would you give on what Elvis just told us? And you study, I believe, why young adults go into entrepreneurship. Can you tell us maybe if they initially choose for the formal sector or the informal sector, why they choose one or the other? And then also linking back to the theme of this session of entrepreneurship and innovation, what does innovation mean to them, and how do they incorporate that in the entrepreneurial journey?
Thank you very much, and I would like to say that he has virtually said everything I have in mind, but coming from the perspective of the question you're asking, going by the GEM reports that I have been going through since 2013, there is this consistency that entrepreneurial attitude is very high in Africa. And I keep wondering, if entrepreneurial attitude is high in Africa and we look at the demography, I keep asking myself, is it the same with a typical young African? And that led to studying the entrepreneurial attitude among young people. And my findings show that young Africans do not necessarily pursue entrepreneurship at the initial thinking. They are being pushed to think about entrepreneurship, not that they are being pulled to think about entrepreneurship. And moving into the field to ask questions, we realize that the fear of the non-availability of jobs after graduation from school forces most of them now to start thinking of entrepreneurship. What can I do rather than just staying back at home rather than being a burden on parent and that. So, and interestingly, majority of these young people find support in the informal sector, not necessarily the formal sector. And that is why I had to dig further. These are concepts of SMEs. Are we really getting the concept right? And we realize that we have more of informal micro entrepreneurs, not necessarily the small and medium scale entrepreneurs that we presume that we have. And last year, a global report released by the IFC in collaboration with McKinsey confirmed that even though access to capital is a general problem across the globe, but for the African continent, it is so peculiar in the sense that only less than 10% of SMEs who claim not to have access to capital operate in the formal sector. More than 19% of these SMEs still operate in the informal sector. And probably that could be responsible for why they still have problems, challenges, accessing credit. And the same thing is applicable when you look at most of our young people today, especially in the streets of Lagos, which most of my studies are being carried out. You realize that majority of them who claim to be entrepreneurs are simply informal micro entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Thank you. So I turn to the entrepreneur on the podium, Tom Bentley. You started a company, Afro Botanics. I believe not targeted to people like me because it's for premium hair products. So obviously I'm not in your target. Using African botanic oils. So what do you think of what Shitu just said in terms of the access to capital? Basically only 10% of the entrepreneurs are in the formal sector, and that may be the reason why access of capital is difficult. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey, and also how you have integrated innovation into your journey.
Okay. I think I'll start with the second part, tell my entrepreneurial journey,
Sure.
in a way answering your first question. So I left government. I studied politics and philosophy, and I left government to go into entrepreneurship because I felt entrepreneurship is where I can make most impact in terms of inspiring a new generation of entrepreneurs. I knew that I wanted to go into manufacturing because I believe that the future of entrepreneurship will be in manufacturing, or the future of the continent anyway, will be in manufacturing, but we're not seeing enough growth of manufacturers in South Africa. And I was inspired by my grandmother to go into Afro-Botanics. She was a traditional medicine healer, and she learned from her grandmother how to mix different herbs for different medicinal purposes, and she showed me how they used to use different aloe vera and marula oil to make their natural hair soft. And at that time, in 2010, that was when just generally in the global beauty market, natural products were taking a very big, upward trajectory, especially black women in the diaspora as well. And I knew that it was a trend that was going to come to South Africa and Africa eventually. So that's how I started doing natural hair products for natural hair in South Africa. And I'd never done business before, but I knew it wasn't difficult to write the business plan I wanted to write. And therein lies both a challenge and a good thing. Because I think if I knew everything I know now about business, I would have stayed in my job. And my business wouldn't exist, and it wouldn't be the medium-sized business it is now. And I think not knowing too much gave me an optimism and a resilience that you generally don't have if you probably know all the challenges you'll experience. So I funded my business by using my pension. After I resigned from work, I had about, it's about the equivalent of $30,000 that I put into the business. By 2012, within a year, I'd run out of money. I had to lose my home, I lost my car, because I had to make sure that all the money I was making went back into the business. I couldn't get financing because all funders were saying you need to prove concepts and you need to have access to market. I couldn't get access to market because I didn't have money. So South Africa has a very good and strong formal sector, so formal retail chains. There's about 3,000 formal retail stores that you can get into. And they won't take you if you're a small business. They want to deal with big brands. They want to deal with international brands. So I couldn't get into those because I don't have money, but I couldn't get money because I couldn't get into those stores. So what could I do? I had to start using what innovation is available. So I used social media to create hype and knowledge and awareness about my business. So people started buying my product. There was word of mouth. I used PR to get into radio, into magazines, and awareness grew. And by the end of 2015, I was able to get into the first formal retail chain, which was Game. By 2016, by the end of 2016, I was in 400 stores. Currently, I'm in 1,000 stores, and I'm in 8 African countries, including Uganda, including Ghana. And all of this is still, in a way, without access to finance. I haven't yet been able to find any financing. South Africa, we have people who have money who could be investors, but they're very conservative and prefer to invest in the stock exchange than to invest in entrepreneurs like myself. I've had to build my credit name through the bank, get overdraft facilities, get them to fund my machinery, and grow slower than I could have if I had a long runway in terms of getting funding. So if I had gotten the $1 million I think I need for financing, I'd be much further as a business. And so the kind of innovation that a business like mine uses is, what I like to say is that I use African wisdom with a touch of science, because when you look at the whole trend of going natural, whether it's natural foods, natural beauty, beauty alone is a $500 billion business. Health and wellness, which is like the health supplements, natural supplements, it's a $4 trillion business. But Africa doesn't have a big brand up there. All the big brands benefiting from that money are from outside, but they get all of the resources, whether shea butter, coconut oil, baobab oil, they get them from South Africa or from Ghana or from Africa. They just it's the same way in terms of our our commodities, where gold is extracted but beneficiated outside of the continent. The same thing's happening with natural botanical ingredients. So the innovation that I'm working with the University of Pretoria and the CSIR in South Africa is to move a step ahead and extract more natural goodness that I can put into to make my products effective, my skin products, my hair products, the food products that I'm going into more effective. Because there's a huge market, and it's time for us to start, first of all, producing brands that we consume, and start producing global brands that are competing with the Unilever brands out there. That's my story.
Thank you. So, in your congratulations, yes. So in your story, you are basically, I think, if I understood it well, not completely agreeing with Shitu on the access to capital, because you operate in the formal sector and you had difficulty to access capital, and you still have difficulty to access capital. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I also do some research. I'm writing a book currently where I'm featuring female manufacturing businesses that are medium-sized in South Africa, and all 7 of those businesses have been self-funded. even though we've already accumulated assets in terms of machinery and all of that, it's still very difficult to access investor funding. And I think that's a South African peculiarity, because I think if you look at Nigeria, there is investor funding. I think maybe the issue in Nigeria is the lack of credible businesses that have, gained enough traction to get that kind of, to attract that kind of funding. In South Africa, there is finance and funding and investor money is very conservative, in my view.
Thank you. So, Shitu, do you think it's a peculiarity of the South African market, or?
I wouldn't say that access to the challenges in terms of access to credit is a South African, is peculiar to South Africa alone. I think it's a general problem across the African continent. Okay, and why am I saying this is in University of Lagos, for example, we have a Center for Entrepreneurship and Skills Development where we encourage students to go into entrepreneurship. And interestingly, several of our students are into one business or the other. And you realize that when they approach, especially the microfinance institutions, the first thing they look at is, oh, you're still young, you're still in school. 2, the probability that the business is going to be sustainable, 0. 3, and the certainty that you're thinking small, you're starting small, but are you really thinking big? Okay? They look at all those parameters, and at the end of the day, they look at you and say, So, in University of Lagos now, what we're also trying to do, in addition to creating incubation center, is to come up with ideas that would bring forth venture capital and seed funding opportunities for our students. However, outside of the university settings, okay, my interaction with other informal micro entrepreneurs shows that the challenge of access to capital or credit is also a function of the credit infrastructure that is available to us. Okay, for instance, we're still at a very low help in terms of having credit bureaus, credit institutions that could dig to find out or investigate how credit worthy an informal micro entrepreneur is. Hence, for you to really say you have another criteria they use is a collateral, which means that you must have a landed property. And but recently I also discovered that most of the informal micro entrepreneurs that we have are only on rented land, which they cannot even use as what? Collateral. So the challenge, I wouldn't say is peculiar to South Africa. It's also peculiar to, it's also a reigning challenge in Nigeria. And I'm optimistic that it's also the same for other African countries.
So,
if I may?
yeah, sure.
All right. Yes, I do agree with Shitu that lack of capital is not peculiar to any specific country. And I also would want to add that I don't think lack of capital is peculiar to informal enterprises. I think it's a general obstacle to all businesses. And I think I would even want to say that it's not about lack of capital. It's mainly about the cost of capital. So for example, if a small enterprise is going to go for a loan, in addition to the collateral and other requirements, in Ghana, for example, they are required to pay monthly over 30% of interest. How many businesses, okay, after a month of borrowing, can make returns and pay 30% on interest? It's just not feasible. And I think the main reason for the high cost of capital is just simply because most African governments tend to borrow from domestic financial market. And because they borrow from the domestic financial market, they tend to crowd out the small businesses, the informal enterprises that can or that rely on this on this credit in the market. But there is something else. We do have also the informal financial market. So the informal enterprises most often do not go to the formal financial market for credits and for loans because of the problem Shitu has already mentioned. But I think one other issue there is also the security of this credit and also the cost of this credit. So if the cost of credit can be reduced by simply disciplining our government to stop borrowing from domestic financial markets, I think partly the problem can be resolved. But also, I'm not ignorant to know that just simply providing capital to enterprises will solve the problem. No, it doesn't. There are multiplicity of obstacles these enterprises face. So we need to tackle these issues from a very holistic and multi perspective than just simply looking at lack of capital or cost of capital.
So what are the other obstacles you are thinking of?
One, for informal enterprises, for example, that I'm very familiar with, I mostly advocate for, is that government policy, most of the time, tends to be very detrimental to the activities of informal enterprises, for example. So resolving these issues go beyond simply providing credit to, say, informal enterprises, but just not. I think the most effective approach will be that government policy should stop trying to close down informal enterprises, but instead try to enable these enterprises to operate. Because there are a lot of things that happen in the informal sector that could go a long way to enable sort of the whole national economy to progress.
Sure.
One or two things. In addition to what he has just said, I want to corroborate that because I also discovered that the informal micro-entrepreneurs are a quite interesting player in the innovation ecosystem in Africa. And I discovered that the concept of social capital is really playing significant role in the survival of these enterprises. And not just the social capital, I also realized that they have other forms of alternative funding which goes down to their indigenous financing options. And, but we still do not have a total understanding of what this indigenous financing options looks like, but most of them also tap into these indigenous financing options. And that's a critical area that I think the young ones need to look up to. It doesn't attract too much of interest, but the key word based on our findings is trust. In as much as you can fulfill the trust requirement, you get the necessary support from friends, family, clients. I don't know how to describe the other.
I can add to that. So there's been a lot of research in the informal sector in South Africa, and what's interesting is that they found that the informal sector is mostly in the townships, and they found that the informal sector is now being dominated by people coming from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from Somalia, from Ethiopia. And those people are able to build and muscle out South African informal businesses because they build those networks. They put money together, buy in bulk, and are able to sell at a cheaper price. Whereas the South Africans have not yet come together to what we call stokvels. I don't know if it's a common understood concept, but a stokvel is where we all put money together and spend it for the benefit of everyone. And in the case of Ethiopians, of Somalis, of Bangladeshis, they put money together and they invest in each other's businesses. So they'll start one store, and when that store has grown, they'll open another store for another person, and so forth. And they've literally taken over all the townships in South Africa. And it's a very interesting concept that now some South Africans are actually looking at it and formalizing it. We do have one, it's called Brown Cents, where even I contribute 100 Rand every month to the Stokvel, it's like a cooperative. And they, the management, whoever we've chosen, then give a certain amount of money, the equivalent of about $5,000 a month, investing in a certain small business to help them with the cash flow. And it's been going on for a year, and I think we've already invested in about 10 businesses, and you can see that those businesses are growing, and they've started to pay back that money into the fund, and eventually the fund will be able to bring in more businesses. So that is another option that could work for small businesses.
Okay, so we have some, I guess, ideas or startup ideas on how to help informal businesses. Now, if we look at the theme of this conference, addressing Africa's challenges, if we look at the theme of this afternoon, to build resilient and competitive economies, do you think that the solution is helping the informal enterprises and the informal sector, or but staying in the informality, or do we need to grow the formal sector? Do we have? You mentioned global. You mentioned African global brands. You mentioned the importance of manufacturing. Is it something that really can come today from the informal sector, or do we need to help the informal enterprises, but also go beyond that?
I think, for the most part, the informal sector are people who are buying and selling. There are a few who are creating and selling. So there's been many arguments I've read about formalizing the informal sector, insofar as it enabling them to become banked and to build their credit bureau identities. In South Africa, we've got a very strong credit bureau, which I think is sometimes to our detriment. I don't really have an answer to that, except to say that I think that as a business, I struggle to get my products into the informal sector. Getting products into the informal sector is more expensive for me than to get it into formal retail, because I take my products from my factory and I deliver to the distribution center of, let's say, Pick n Pay. But to go into formal sector, I must then take my truck and deliver to 200 little stores. And that's a lot of money, so it costs a lot of money. So that's why the global brands are able to benefit more from the informal sector. And that's why we are not able to penetrate the informal sector yet. That's where there's a lot of spending power in terms of money. So I don't know how to answer that. I just do know that if there were more manufacturers of products in Africa, and we were able to grow them to be big enough to then supply the informal sector. Because I know where I buy my ingredients from. I buy my ingredients from the mamas in the rural community in Zimbabwe, the rural community in Swaziland, the rural community in Limpopo. I know, and I'm sustainably providing income to those communities. I don't know where Unilever buys their ingredients from, but I do know that if I was able to get my products into the informal sector, I would be able to employ more people. There'd be more manufacturing capacity. So it's very complicated. I think there's no single answer into what will work and which way will work, because also informal sectors have different characters in different countries. It's not the same thing. The informal sector in South Africa is not the same as the informal sector in Nigeria. So I don't have an answer.
Yes, Elvis.
Yeah, thank you. I think being resilient and competitive requires you to be inclusive and having the ability to adapt knowledge being foreign or local into local context. And informal enterprises do this on a daily basis. They resolve some of the key challenges they face by simply trying to overcome these challenges by using local knowledge, by using knowledge that is available to them, and just trying to resolve these petty and numerous challenges they face every day. So for me, I think that speaks for itself. So in literature, in the innovation literature, is often touted that local knowledge and the ability to adopt and adapt knowledge into local context is very key in resolving and driving growth. Informal enterprises do this every day. So why can't we enhance, stimulate, promote, incubate, and nurture this? I think for me, that is where our problem stems from. We are unable to understand what we do locally, but we would want we are not able to crawl, but we want to walk. And there's no possible we can walk without crawling. And I think looking at it from a perspective of this is what we want to get to, but this is what we have. How can we use what we have to get to where we want to be? For me, that is fundamental to how we develop.
In addition to that, I would want to emphasize the need for us to appreciate learning. Learning is a daily activity that takes place in the informal setting. Unfortunately, when we look at the categorization of these enterprises, what we do have is micro, small, medium enterprises. But when policy are being designed and at the implementation stage, what we often hear is small and medium enterprises, which means whether consciously or unconsciously, we take away the micro aspect of it. And I can tell you that there's so much to learn from this micro enterprise sector. In addition to that, I'm looking at our issue of technology know-how. Okay, there is so much going on among the informal micro enterprise, and I wish we could see a situation where our educational system, okay, can be blended with some of the activities going on in the informal sector. I'll give you an example. We had a labor market study last year, myself and some colleagues from the IDS in the UK, as to whether indeed there are no jobs. And we discovered that there are jobs. However, relative to the total number of young people we are producing or that we have in Africa, there are no jobs. But relative to young people who have the skills, who have the competence, and who have the capability, there are more than enough jobs. And one of these, we had an encounter with a manufacturer who said that he would rather prefer to employ a young chap who has the experience of an informal setting, who has done all the practicals. He prefers such to someone who has gone to the university for 5 years, studied an engineering course for 5 years, but yet still does not have hands-on experience. So if there's a way we could extend our either internship opportunities, apprenticeship, or we have what we call CWES in Nigeria, whereby you are expected to go for like a 3-month field work, okay, such that there could be this interaction between what our students are learning in school and they go to this field to have hands-on experience. Gradually, we can have a case of knife sharpening knife. We learn from them, they learn from us, and you see that in the course of doing that, a network of relationship is created As such, the informal can now grow trajectorically into what? The small, and into the medium, and finally into a large enterprise. And that is what I think we need in Africa. Let us monitor the growth trajectory rather than just expecting an enterprise to start from a particular level and blossom just like that. Can we begin to have a case where we start small, grow big, then think international? I think that would be a very good way to go.
So we know there is lots of innovation in the informal sector and a large informal sector in Africa, but that they have that has its peculiarities and difficulties. So. What do we do next? What do we do next? Because we heard also from the previous session that we are not, in Africa generally, we don't have the growth rate that we need to have. Someone mentioned that we cannot be partying on a 6 or 7% growth rate because we need double-digit growth rate. So how do we accelerate, I guess, this transition from micro to SME to large? What do you think, Tom Bentley? If you are in the SME category, right? So I'm asking you, what do you need to become a large one, to become a continental one, to become a global company?
So just to take you a bit back to, I think, something the doctor here said, and you know, it's obviously something that's possibly peculiar to South Africa, but I know it's also peculiar to Nigeria because I'm currently having the issues of trying to get my products into Nigeria. So if you are a micro business in South Africa right now, and let's say you have a small store where you're selling food, cooking food, and you're providing, or even if you're making small juices and you're selling it in your community, you can easily do that. You don't even have to really apply for a license to set up your store. You probably will get away without paying tax. You get away without paying VAT. Quite a lot of things that help you remain a bit protected, right? So the moment you start to formalize the informal sector, let's say that business and it maybe moves into an urban area or maybe even becomes a manufacturer and wants to supply the bigger formalized retailers, immediately your costs escalate because now all of a sudden you must meet all sorts of audit and health and all sorts of things that you have to now meet, and you must pay hundreds and thousands of rands just to say you are compliant before you even start producing your product, right? So that's why I was saying to you that I don't know whether we need to be pushing for formalization, because formalization then becomes an expense that the informal business will have, the micro business will have to carry in the case of South Africa. So how do we move micro businesses to medium size? At the end of the day, you know, I don't know how else they categorize it, but you know, I moved from micro because when I started out, I had someone manufacture for me, and then when I decided to start my own manufacturing, I was manufacturing in my garage. And then when I realized that, no, I want to start supplying a big retailer, I knew I had to get a factory. I had to now make sure that I have people who I register and in the labor relations, and I had to have all sorts of things. I think, first of all, we need to train people because I got into so much trouble. I had to go to courts, you know, the labor court, to explain why I didn't know certain things. So we need that kind of, I don't like the incubations that we have now. I sort of like the kind of incubation that incubates you as you go, as you're on the road, right? Because I was part of a few incubators. A lot of them taught me things I didn't need to know right now. So I prefer the kind of incubation or, I don't know, training that goes with me where I am at that point. I think that's the only way to empower people, is giving them what they need at the point where they are, instead of giving us knowledge that we may only need. I mean, there's lots of training I went to that I still haven't needed up until now. So I think that's what we need. The kind of body, or even universities, university students who go into micro businesses and say, look, this is what you need to do, formalize this, do this way, and this will attract more customers, because the only way you grow as a business is by increasing your turnover, right? So how do you increase your turnover? This is how you increase your turnover. This is how you do your marketing. This is how you stand out in terms of competition. No policy can help you do those basic things that you need to do as a business, I think. So we need structures that can help businesses and business people, because as I don't know which of the doctor said, that most people don't go into business because they really want to be entrepreneurs. They get pushed into it because they've got no jobs. So people need that information, that guidance once they're in it. And, grow your business step by step, do the right things is what's going to help us grow those micro enterprises into small business, into medium enterprises, into small businesses. I think that's what needs to happen.
Elvis?
Incremental innovations are indeed widespread in the private sector on the continent. And we've heard from several conversations today that we need the radical innovations, we need the destructive innovations. Yes, I do agree that radical innovations are important. Radical innovations drive progress. Radical innovations drive economic development. But let's take any radical innovation that we know today, and you would agree with me that they were fundamentally built on incremental innovations. No big idea came out of nothing. The electricity came from several failures and knowledge gathered along the failures to come up with the electricity. The computer the same, the mobile phone the same, the internet the same. But what we tend to do on the continent is we tend to ignore these marginal improvements. Marginal improvements are fundamental to the big things that we tend to do maybe some years to come. So what I would want to add to that is that incremental innovations or marginal improvements build your technological capacity. And as you build technological capacity, you learn, as Chitu mentioned, you learn, one, how to imitate. If you know how to imitate, one day you would probably come out with a radical innovation. But if we discourage this fundamental process, which may not be linear, we may be discouraging our own radical innovations. So I would want to add, there is an African proverb that says that if we think that small things can make a difference, then you haven't spent a night with the mosquito. And that, for me, is very important. The mosquito alone in one night can cause you a very sleepless night. So incremental innovations are very important. Incremental innovations need to be encouraged. Incremental innovations need to be incubated because they may drive the radical innovations that would, or that may need, that may be solving some of our local challenges, our local problems we have on the continent today.
Shito, just before maybe you also answer, I want to challenge a little bit the last, what Elvis said. Again, referring to one of the comments in the previous session, where one of the speakers mentioned the urgency we are in because of the demographics, because of the need of jobs creation. So I personally understand the incremental innovation concept or incremental progress concept. I can even support it, but is it a fit to the current context of many African countries? Can we live with that, or do we just need more? Even if we, if we would want to do it more, at a slower pace or more comfortable pace, is it really something we can afford?
want me to answer that?
Yes.
Okay. When you look at the concept of incremental innovation and its application to our local context, I quite agree with you that it may be very expensive, but that is actually the way to go. Besides that, I want to see a situation where we can start with our incubation resources. I think that is where our innovation should start. Ordinarily, when you tell someone incubation, the first thing he thinks of is technology. You want to come up with one ICT program or the other. But indeed, all of these players in this sector needs one incubation resource or the other. It varies. It could be in terms of space, it could be in terms of advice, it could be in terms of free consulting, etc. So, I want to see us in Africa coming up with our own indigenous incubation. Let's reconfigure what incubation is and let it suit our own context. Besides that, I want to see a strategic collaboration between the three main players: the government, our higher institutions of learning, and these informal entrepreneurs. The government, of course, just as we have heard since, we need that political support, we need that institutional support, and we also need favorable policies that will take into consideration the interest of these informal micro-entrepreneurs. And for the higher institutions of learning, of course, they can do research. There are certain things these informal entrepreneurs do not have the capability to do. For example, I have met an informal entrepreneur in the automobile industry who tells me that, oh, there are some things he needs to learn, and he knows that he could get some of these informations online. But he still does not even know how to use the internet. And just across the road is a tertiary institution. And we put it across to him. Have you ever walked into this institution to ask? He said simply because it was not a small business, it was not recognized, that they only have facility for small businesses. They've forgotten that informal micro will one day grow to be a small business if guided adequately. Okay? So the higher institutions of learning also have a critical role to play. I mentioned something earlier. It is high time we encourage our students in higher institutions of learning to rub minds with these informal micro-entrepreneurs. They have so much to learn from them in the sense of shaping their entrepreneurial mindset and getting to learn some of the pitfalls that they could encounter when they decide to venture into entrepreneurship fully. At the same time, having students from the university coming to you, rubbing mind with you, is a source of inspiration for so many of these informal micro-entrepreneurs, for them to also aspire higher. And that could hasten, quicken our growth from informal micro to small and medium enterprises. And finally, the informal micro-entrepreneurs themselves also have a role to play. They should be encouraged to appreciate networking, especially among themselves. There is this competition that goes on so much among themselves that secrecy is not only limited to formal and large enterprises. They don't understand what intellectual property is, but I tell you, they keep so many secrets away from them out of the fear of what? Competition. They need to learn to share ideas. I think it's called learning by sharing. Learning by sharing, that should also be encouraged among them. And I think if we do all of that, though it's a complex thing, it's not linear as we are saying it, But I believe sooner or later, we would get to where we are going.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we'll take some questions from the floor, if there are any. Then yes, I see many.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah. Thank you, presenters, for a very interesting evening. I want to reiterate some of the things that have already been said by way of comments. And my first comment is that I think we Africans, must learn or must not forget to solve African problems in an African way. We must be able to identify our unique African problems, try to solve them the African way. You know, this importation of the, technology and everything else that we're importing, while it has its own attractions, can be very distracting. We cannot forget that informal businesses drive the African economy. I mean, everybody can attest to that. And then we must not also forget African values, which form the informal structures. What comes to my mind now is I have an NGO where we mobilize women, empower women, and for about 8 years, we had what you would call susu in Nigeria, where each of these women contributes money to a purse. So about 15 of them used to contribute 100,000 naira every month. And so 1.5 million naira would go to one person who would start a business or invest in her business. And for about 8 years, there was never any problem of money not being returned, even though we did not have a legal document binding us. So informal structures such as trust, such as family, such as culture, still play a very major role in whatever business decisions people take today. So when we sit down like this, I don't think we should throw those issues away, because we are Africans. We just have to do it the African way if we want to succeed. And then that brings to mind, we are talking about inclusiveness. Now you find a whole set of people that are being set aside. What is this set of people? People between the ages of 40, 45, 35. You find now that even when you have people like the Elumelu Foundation in Nigeria, you cannot even apply if you are a certain age. But like someone said here, most people don't just wake up from school. Maybe now, yes, more people are doing that. But before now, you don't really have people who just wake up and say they want to be entrepreneurs. They decide to go into one entrepreneurial activity or the other after they have failed on many fronts. Either they have stayed for years, 10 years, 12 years, looking for jobs, and then suddenly they realize there's something else to do. And at the point of that realization, they are outside that age bracket. Where are you leaving them? To the streets to become armed robbers? So I think we should reconsider some of the things. When we are copying the European models, we must remember that we have an African way of doing things and try to do it that way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, the presenters, for the wonderful presentations. One thing that Caleb Muyiwa Adilo from Nigeria. The issue of capital is what I intend to address. We talk about the process by which small businesses or micro businesses can access funds. Innovation fund is very critical at almost 1% or 1-digit interest rate. But this is largely missing across Africa when you look at the way we do our business. So if we can encourage this, this is going to promote even all these small businesses, and also mentorship process is also not there. It is true that in most universities, the students are interested in entrepreneurship or becoming entrepreneurs, even in the future. But how do we mentor them? And who are those people that we mentor them? That goes back even to the lecturers, the teachers in the university. They need a kind of a change in their orientation towards teaching in the classrooms. And also it also borders on the curriculum that we study today. Can the curriculum that we are studying, that we are using today, cater for the future that we desire? If not, can't we revamp the entire system to give us what is going to make us even a liberated continent, even in the future? And also, innovation infrastructure in Africa or across Africa is also very weak. For instance, in Nigeria, we don't have innovation fund. No. The closest one that we have, that's a bank of industry. They practice what we call selective investment. They don't give you because your business is viable. They look at who are you, where are you coming from. So many barriers have been set up even to send you out and for you not to be qualified to access it. So we need to liberalize even the system so that the winners, those who have business that has potential for the future can actually access even this fund. Also the incubators, science, the concept of science parks also is one of the things or one of the infrastructure that can actually fast-track the development of small-scale enterprises across Africa, particularly the technology-oriented ones. And essentially, those that will be coming from the research institutions or universities. So these are things that we can begin to look at and see how we can add value even to our product that are coming from ourselves. And I support even what my sister just mentioned. Let's look within. What do we have? The cooperative system. That is what we are born with. We do it together. You can liaise with your colleagues, and then you get your problem resolved. And I have one question for Madam. How do you handle intellectual property that are associated with your product and the process as well? Because the technology that you are using, how do you acquire them, is very important. If they are developed locally, how do you tend to harness value without violating the intellectual property issue? And for my colleagues as well, what are the roles of universities in all these things? In informal sector, are universities really, engaging with the practitioners to ensure that, yes, their challenges are attended to, and vice versa? That is, do they bring their problems to the university? And what can we do on the planet, on the continent, to ensure that, yes, whenever they have problems, they can approach us, they can approach the university or research institutions, even for solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let's start with Tom Bentley, if you can address the question on
intellectual property. Interestingly enough, when I first started out and I wanted to register, intellectual properties and all of that, I found it was very expensive. So I operated without registering any protection. And then along the way, there were government institutions. South Africa does have government institutions that provide this kind of service for free, called CEDA. Unfortunately, it takes forever for them to be responsive. So how I did it, luckily there was, ironically, a young group of guys. They are lawyers, and they are using technology to make it cheaper to register trademarks, intellectual property, and things like that. So we do everything over the internet. They register in the different countries for you, whatever country you want to. And it cost me 1/10 of the amount because I guess the technology that they use makes it affordable for them to charge that price. But yeah, that's what I've done. The normal route is quite expensive to do. A lot of people operate without protection, but they call legal legends, and they make it cheaper and affordable for us to protect our intellectual know-how and trademark as well in different markets across.
Thank you. So maybe Elvis and Shitu thereafter to wrap up on the role of the universities. I think practically, how can universities concretely, practically help entrepreneurs in the informal sector or even in the formal sector?
So the framework on which most innovation policies are based on the continent is the National Innovation System. And the National Innovation System shows or indicates quite clearly the various roles of actors, of which universities are one. And it also shows the linkages and interactions that are supposed to be between the various actors with sort of in an institutional setting. So universities are very important in the ecosystem, but most often we don't have these linkages between the actors in the system. And the problem we have is also that we don't recognize all the actors that are supposed to be in the innovation system. So we don't have the actors in the system. How then do we establish the linkages between these actors with the investors, for example? But there is a very interesting example or case coming out from Uganda where I think SEDAT, University of Kampala with SEDAT, that they produce their own local cars. And these local cars are produced as a joint collaboration between the University of Kampala and informal car makers. So there we see that the government has put up a framework that encourages, this interaction already. So the universities help, or attract or give the informal car makers specific contracts to help them come up with these local cars. Of course, there are things that these informal car makers have no clue about, which the university lecturers and the professors know in the books. And there are some practical things that these guys who repair cars every day know much more about that the professors have no clue about. And with that sort of interaction, we do have a car coming out. So these interactions are very important. They need to be encouraged. And it's one very practical way that we see these interactions playing out, and we see a physical product coming up as an innovation. So that's one way. I think the Ugandan case is a very good example of how the interactions between the actors can lead to development. And briefly, if I may want to touch on the Innovation Fund. So the STISA 2023 and the AU Agenda 2063 reinforces the need for all African governments to spend at least 1% of their GDP on R&D, but most of them don't do it. And the problem here is also that the private sector, most of the time, do not engage in R&D. So in terms of R&D knowledge, we don't have it. So we need the government at least to be dedicated, one, to research and development, and be dedicated, two, to innovation. Because there are differences between science policy, technology policy, and innovation policy. And these differences must be made clear to policymakers. They need to understand these differences, and they need to move from simply changing their ministries of science and technology to Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation, to doing something very practical that helps the innovation process itself.
Thank you.
Okay. I may not be able to speak for all the universities in Nigeria, but on a general note, universities do have a role to play in promoting innovation in the informal sector. And in the University of Lagos, Nigeria, we do appreciate this, And that actually culminated into our own innovation policy. The university has drafted an innovation policy of its own, and this policy mandates that, one, academia now needs to focus more on solution-driven research, okay? And number two, it emphasizes university-industry collaboration, okay, without any specifics, whether it is the informal, medium, or large enterprises. And finally, the university now encourages the design thinking methodology. In fact, that led to the establishment or the creation of what we call the biomedical engineering department, which brings together faculty members from business, humanities, engineering, pharmacy, and the medical school. And all of these, their mandate is to look into not buying new equipment, but we have some equipment that are on ground that we assume they are out of date. So you need to dismantle them and retool them. And these concepts are actually common among the informal players. So they say to retool and retool and things like that. But most importantly, I feel strongly that university needs to interact with the informal sector. If that can be done successfully, then we would move further in our quest to achieve innovation on the continent.
Good. Thank you so much. I think that in the discussion we had, we started to scratch the surface, I think, of some possible solution and some avenues we should look into further. We mentioned incubating on the go for companies, building and supporting the informal sector and learning from it. Other ways of pulling capital together to support companies. So I think it's only, we'll agree that it's only scratching the surface of what needs to happen. Luckily, we still have 2 more days of conference and other days thereafter. So I think in the interest of time, we'll have to close here. I want to thank the panelists for being here today, and then encourage all of you to attend the cultural event that the government is organizing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.